So I want to start by thanking Collective Leadership for Scotland for giving me this opportunity to introduce Three Horizons as a framework for transformative innovation over the course of these two workshops. In the first one, we looked at the method and used the method really as a scanning framework to construct a map of the landscape of change of Scotland under the influence of COVID-19. And in this second workshop, we're going to process that map and look at it a bit more closely and look for a direction of travel through that landscape that looks promising for realizing the future that we aspire to. So it's a combination really of exploring the method, but also putting it to use in the context of the landscape that we're experiencing right now. Say that this is Three Horizons in the context of the practice of transformative innovation. And that's the practice of growing the new in the presence of the old. And that's really the point of doing this work. Three Horizons, mapping the landscape. It's not just about drawing the map, it's also about getting into action, transformative action, and creating the future that we want. And that practice of transformative innovation has a number of aspects to it. In the first workshop, we focused on patterns. That's using Three Horizons to map the landscape of change. And today we're going to look at pathways. So how to find the best routes through that landscape towards the future that we desire, the one that we've identified for ourselves. Now, the next step clearly is practice. And that's setting out on the journey, getting into action. That, as I say, is the point of this work, to create the future. We're not going to be looking at that in detail today, but I hope you will leave with all that you need to prepare for transformative innovation. And finally, in IFF, we also pay attention to people. So since the journey is likely to be novel and uncertain and across some possibly difficult territory, ideally we should also develop our 21st century competencies to enhance our chances of success. Now, there are plenty of resources and templates and kits and materials and so on to support you in this. So, as I am very fond of saying, do try this at home. Please use the tools and the frameworks, and just get in touch if you need any guidance or support for doing so. Let me start then, turning to today's workshop, with a quick recap on the Three Horizons framework. As we said last time, it describes three patterns of activity in the present. That's very important. They're visible in the present. It shows those patterns of activity and the ways in which these three patterns, these three horizons, interact with each other over time to create the future. Now, the first horizon pattern, H1, is the dominant business as usual pattern that we've all come to rely on in any domain. But because nothing lasts forever, this too will inevitably start to fail eventually as the world changes. And we're seeing that big time right at the moment. And that's the challenge for managers who are responsible for keeping our H1 systems running. If we're still around in the future, then a new pattern will emerge that is better suited to the world that emerges in the future. This is the third horizon, H3. And we can trace it back to the actions of visionaries in the present who've imagined a different future and are embodying it today. It is visible in the present. And that leaves a second horizon, a wave of innovation that links H1 and H3, a zone of transition. And this is the domain of the entrepreneur, looking for opportunities to try new things. Some will help fix the problems of H1 that we've been talking about, sustaining innovation. And some will help to grow a new H3 pattern, or at least make more space for it. And that's what we call transformative innovation. And that's a vital distinction between sustaining innovation and transformative innovation. And it's one of the insights that this Three Horizons framework offers. Now, using the framework allows us to see all of these three patterns and to track how they play out against each other over time. But we can also hear them in many meetings and professional conversations. And we tried this as an exercise in the last workshop, a dialogue between the voice of the manager, the voice of the entrepreneur, and the voice of the visionary. So at one level, Three Horizons is a conversational practice, just facilitating the conversation between these three voices, these three perspectives. But we can also use the framework to map the landscape and to get a feel for how it's changing. And that's what we did before these workshops. We invited people to complete a simple questionnaire, and you can do this too in your context. All it needs to do is to ask 5 questions in order to populate these 5 parts of the map. H1 concerns, third horizon aspirations, where the third horizon is already showing up in the present, and the baby we don't want to throw out with the bathwater, that's the enduring features of the first horizon that we want to preserve through the change. That's down there in the bottom right-hand corner. So this is the map that we generated together from the survey results and in our workshop on the 7th of May. There's a lot of detail here and we won't go into it now. We'll come back to that later. But as you can see, it's a pretty comprehensive map of the territory of the challenges that COVID is placing on Scotland at the moment, the innovations that are springing up naturally in response, our aspirations that are beginning to crystallize for the future beyond this period, the hope and encouragement that that's possible from some of the activity that's already springing up in the present, the enduring features of the first horizon we don't want to lose. It's all here. And you'll see along the top there some of the enablers for that transition, what will help us make the journey. And down the bottom in the middle, the pivotal shifts, the shifts in thinking and the patterns of assumption that might make the difference between sustaining innovation and transformative innovation. So here's a summary. And as I say, once we have a third horizon in view, and only then, we can then make that distinction between sustaining innovation to improve H1 and transformative innovation to grow a new H3. And those pivotal shifts were what we looked at in the last workshop, the shifts in thinking and assumptions that might make the difference between simply improving the present system and transforming to something very different. And that came up with some very interesting examples there. For example, what might help? What might be the shift? A shift to making space for slow reflection, for holding our nerve, making a fundamental shift in assumptions, looking beyond services, and so on. So a pretty sophisticated analysis, both of the territory and what it might take to shift beyond business as usual to an aspirational third horizon. Now, one suggestion in those pivotal shifts was to move beyond polarization. So to move beyond either or to yes and, a yes and future. And that shift is something that we're going to concentrate on in the workshop today. Specifically, we're going to explore 2 more templates from the IFF's Three Horizons process. We call this phase 2. This is once we have the map, how are we going to analyze it and process it in order to get closer to an agenda for action, which after all is why we're doing this work. Now, these templates are taken from our Three Horizons kit, which has got full instructions for the process, all of these templates, and is available online. So as I say, do try this at home, do find these resources and use them for yourselves. This first template is for identifying what we call the value tensions between the third horizon and the first horizon. Now, often what makes it difficult to realize the future we want is the fact that its values are in tension with other things that we value in the present. So people say we dream of tomorrow, but we don't want to give up today. Lots of people today are saying, for example, that they don't want to go back to the pre-pandemic world. But in truth, there are aspects of that world that we miss and that we value and that we would like to retain, like personal contact. So we love digital connectivity, but we still appreciate face-to-face. These are not either ors, they're in tension. To get at these tensions in the context of the map of the landscape we've already produced, we first ask about H3 values, Horizon 3 values. Start there. What does the Horizon 3 pattern of activity that we've identified value? And then we ask, okay, so if it values this thing, what in the first horizon, what value in the first horizon is in tension with that? And one easy way to get at that is to start with the H3 value and imagine what a well-disposed H1 manager might say in a yes and frame. So they might say yes to the third horizon value. Yes, of course we want person-centered care, and we need to make sure it is universally available without discrimination. In other words, personalization as a value in H3 in tension with universal provision as a value in H1. These are both good and valuable things, but they are in tension. And make sure when you're doing this that it's a real tension between two things that we value, not between a good thing in H3 and a bad thing in H1. That's an easy mistake to make. Easy mistake to make. You might talk about you might describe a tension, for example, between personalization in H3 and mechanization in H1, but those are opposites. They're not in tension. There's no tension involved in moving away from something we don't want. So remember, these are two good things that are in tension. Here's an example from our work on reform of health and social care in NHS Fife from back in 2009. So again, we mapped the landscape of change, the three horizons map of the territory, and then we looked for the value tensions. And here you can see some examples. Horizon 3 values for health and social care: loving, caring, and respectful. Great, yes, and we want the system to be efficient and productive. We want to promote self-reliance and resilience in individuals, families, and communities. Yes, and we have a duty of care, and we provide a safety net for the most vulnerable. These are good things, and they're in tension with each other. And out of those tensions, we can develop, and did in that case, a number of innovation pathways in which we might marry the best of both worlds. Invest in Horizon 3 as our strategic intent. So we're moving towards Horizon 3. Evolve technology with a human face. Grow the workforce to support and participate in the new system. So these were identifying innovation pathways that would allow us to realize the best of both worlds: technology to enable and technology for efficiency, for example. Another way of conducting that exercise is, and to find those innovation pathways, is to use the framework of a dilemma. So we we choose the most significant value tensions from the map, and we treat them not as choices but as dilemmas. And that's this second template. If we work with these tensions not as choices along a spectrum, but as dilemmas, then we open up a more interesting space to work with them. Because it's the nature of a dilemma that if we privilege one value, the other will sooner or later reassert itself. It's not a question of choosing one or the other. And that's precisely the kind of work we want to do. So if we put them orthogonally like this, at right angles to each other, we open up a space in which to explore that tension creatively. So, for example, if we wanted both security, typical first horizon value, security, and freedom, a third horizon value, they're both good things. But if we privilege only security, we'll be safe, but we'll start yearning eventually for freedom. Likewise, if we're all free and anything goes, we will start eventually wanting to maintain or restore a degree of order. So these are It's not an either or choice. It's always a yes and. If we treat them, therefore, those values as a dilemma, we can work through these 5 zones. We can privilege one value or the other. Those are the first 2. What if we only privileged security? Fine. What if we only privileged freedom? We can then look at the compromise zone, a little bit of both, which actually satisfies neither. Where are these in conflict? Where are the conflicts arising? Where are the arguments happening between these 2 values in practice? And only after confronting the conflict and not falling back into compromise can we move to this resolution zone, the zone of dynamic resolution, where we get the best of both worlds. And that discovery of what sits in that box 5 up there, that zone of dynamic resolution, that discovery effectively provides a direction of travel, a navigational pathway towards the best of both worlds and the future that we desire.